A federal courtroom became the scene of an extraordinary emotional collapse yesterday, as a defendant convicted on 68 counts of fraud-related charges learned he would spend the remainder of his life in prison. The 57-year-old defendant, identified as Mr. Harrison, exhibited severe physical distress as the verdicts were read, ultimately requiring assistance from U.S. Marshals to exit the courtroom. The case centered on allegations that Harrison operated a sophisticated Ponzi scheme through his financial services company over a 10-year period. Prosecutors alleged that Harrison promised substantial returns to investors while using funds from new investors to pay earlier participants, creating a false appearance of profitability. According to court documents, Harrison allegedly diverted millions of dollars for personal use, acquiring multiple properties, luxury vehicles, and yachts. When the scheme collapsed, investors reported losses exceeding $300 million. The Federal Bureau of Investigation conducted an extensive investigation that included examination of bank records, email communications, and interviews with former employees. The investigation led to a 68-count indictment charging Harrison with wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, and securities fraud. Each count represented specific fraudulent transactions or communications prosecutors said Harrison used to deceive investors. The trial, which lasted 8 weeks, featured testimony from 40 witnesses and the presentation of thousands of documents. Prosecutors detailed the mechanics of the alleged scheme, including how Harrison purportedly created false account statements and transferred funds through shell companies to conceal his activities. The defense maintained that Harrison mismanaged the business due to incompetence rather than criminal intent. Throughout the 8-week trial, prosecutors presented what they characterized as overwhelming evidence of intentional fraud. The government's case included detailed financial records tracing money flows through various accounts and shell companies. Email communications presented to the jury allegedly showed Harrison discussing strategies to prevent investors from questioning their account statements and instructing employees to produce fraudulent documentation. Defense attorneys argued that their client lacked the criminal intent necessary for fraud convictions. They contended that Harrison made poor business decisions and failed to properly manage the company, but did not deliberately set out to defraud investors. The defense team suggested that the business losses resulted from market conditions and mismanagement rather than criminal conduct. However, prosecutors countered this argument by presenting evidence they said demonstrated Harrison's awareness of the fraudulent nature of his activities. Bank records showed transfers of investor funds to Harrison's personal accounts, which were then used for luxury purchases. Former employees testified about being directed to create false documents and mislead investors about account performance. The prosecution argued these actions reflected deliberate planning rather than business incompetence. After hearing all evidence and arguments, the jury deliberated for 6 days before reaching verdicts on all 68 counts. The presiding judge scheduled the verdict announcement for the following morning. In an unusual procedural decision, the judge indicated she would impose sentencing immediately following the verdict reading, rather than scheduling a separate sentencing hearing weeks or months later, as is customary in federal criminal cases. This decision surprised the defense team, who objected and requested additional time. The judge proceeded with her plan to read the verdicts personally, rather than having the court clerk perform this typical function. Harrison entered the courtroom dressed in a suit, appearing composed. His family members, including his wife and adult children who had attended throughout the trial, occupied seats in the gallery. The judge began reading the verdicts count by count. For the first charge of wire fraud, she announced the jury had found Harrison guilty. He acknowledged the verdict with a slight nod, while his attorney placed a supportive hand on his shoulder. As additional guilty verdicts were announced, observers noted changes in Harrison's demeanor. By the 10th count, his breathing patterns had altered. By the 20th count, he appeared pale, with visible perspiration. His hands began trembling noticeably around the 30th count. As the judge continued through additional counts, Harrison's physical condition deteriorated. Tears appeared on his face around count 40. His shoulders shook by count 50. By count 60, he had bent forward with his head nearly touching the table. His attorney attempted to provide physical support as the trembling intensified. When the judge announced the final guilty verdict on count 68, Harrison emitted what witnesses described as a primal vocalization expressing profound distress. The judge then asked Harrison if he wished to address the court before sentencing, as is standard procedure. Harrison was unable to respond due to his emotional state. His attorney requested a brief recess, noting his client was too distressed to make a statement. The judge denied this request, stating that Harrison had ample time to prepare and chose not to testify or accept responsibility during the trial. The judge proceeded to explain her sentencing reasoning, addressing the factors federal law requires courts to consider. She discussed the nature and circumstances of the offense, the need for deterrence, and the necessity of protecting the public from further crimes. The judge noted the substantial financial harm to victims, the extended duration of the fraudulent scheme, and what she characterized as Harrison's lack of remorse throughout the investigation and trial. The pre-sentence investigation report, prepared by the Federal Probation Office, recommended a sentencing range of 30 to 35 years. However, the judge indicated she believed an upward departure from these guidelines was warranted, given the exceptional circumstances of the case. She emphasized the extraordinary magnitude of financial harm, with losses exceeding $300 million, affecting hundreds of families. The judge stated that Harrison had violated the trust of individuals who relied on him to protect their financial futures, including retirement savings and college funds. The judge then announced her sentencing decision: the maximum allowable sentence of 45 years in federal prison. She explained that under federal sentencing law, Harrison would be required to serve approximately 85% of this sentence, equating to a minimum of 38 years before eligibility for release. Given that Harrison was 57 years old, the judge noted he would be 95 when eligible for release, effectively meaning he would spend his remaining productive years incarcerated. Upon hearing the sentence, Harrison experienced what observers described as a complete emotional breakdown. He became unable to control his vocalizations and breathing. U.S. Marshals were summoned to take him into custody, but he could not stand without assistance. The Marshals physically supported him as they escorted him from the courtroom, while family members in the gallery also displayed emotional distress. From a legal perspective, several aspects of this case are noteworthy. The complete conviction on all 68 counts represents a comprehensive rejection of the defense arguments. While defendants always face the possibility of conviction, the psychological impact of hearing repeated guilty verdicts announced individually can be substantial. Each announcement serves as confirmation of criminal conduct and contributes to the defendant's understanding of the severity of the situation. The judge's decision to impose sentencing immediately after verdicts, while unusual, falls within judicial discretion. Federal judges may choose to proceed with sentencing if they have reviewed pre-sentence reports and determined they have sufficient information. This immediate sentencing prevented the typical delay between verdict and sentencing, which usually allows defendants time to process the verdicts before learning their punishment. The compressed time frame likely intensified the psychological impact on Harrison. A 45-year federal sentence for a 57-year-old defendant is effectively a life sentence. Federal inmates typically serve at least 85% of their sentences, meaning Harrison faces approximately 38 years of incarceration. Given that average life expectancy for American men is 76 years, Harrison is unlikely to survive the full term of imprisonment. The judge acknowledged this reality in her remarks. Victims and their families expressed varied reactions to the sentencing. Some individuals who spoke with media representatives stated they felt justice had been served and the sentence appropriately reflected the harm caused. Others indicated that no sentence could restore their financial losses or undo the damage to their lives. One elderly victim reported losing her entire retirement savings of approximately $2 million and now works part-time to meet basic expenses. She stated that while witnessing Harrison's breakdown provided no satisfaction and did not restore her funds, She valued seeing accountability imposed. Harrison's legal team is expected to file an appeal challenging the sentence. Defense attorneys will likely argue that 45 years constitutes excessive punishment and potentially violates constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. They may contend that sentencing a 57-year-old to effectively die in prison represents disproportionate punishment relative to the non-violent nature of financial crimes. However, legal experts suggest such appeals face significant challenges. Appellate courts generally defer to trial judges' sentencing decisions when proper procedures have been followed and the sentence falls within statutory maximums. In this case, the judge articulated her reasoning, considered the sentencing factors required by federal law, and explained why she believed an upward departure from guideline recommendations was appropriate. The severity of the crimes, the substantial financial harm to numerous victims, and the extended duration of the fraudulent scheme provide justification for an enhanced sentence. Absent procedural errors, appellate courts rarely overturn sentences, particularly when they are based on substantial evidence and reasoned analysis. This case illustrates the serious consequences that can result from large-scale financial fraud in the federal system. Federal sentencing guidelines for fraud offenses incorporate the amount of financial loss, and cases involving hundreds of millions of dollars in losses trigger severe sentencing enhancements. Additionally, sophisticated schemes that target vulnerable victims, such as retirees, may result in further sentencing increases. The dramatic courtroom scene also highlights the human dimension of criminal proceedings. While legal processes focus on evidence, procedures, and statutory requirements, criminal convictions and sentences represent profound life-altering events for defendants and their families. The immediate transition from verdict to sentencing in this case compressed what is typically a gradual process of accepting consequences into a matter of minutes, producing the extreme emotional response observed in court. As the case proceeds through the appellate process, it will continue to serve as an example of how federal courts address large-scale financial fraud and the substantial penalties such conduct can generate.